Keyframe animation and hierarchical rigging. These are totally foundational concepts to what we do. They've been with us since the 1970s. And at this point, they're practically synonymous with the concept of CG character animation. I actually think, however, that they come with huge disadvantages. And I think we can do better, and I think we need to keep exploring other possibilities. I love free publicity. You should give me more of it, please. Oh, whoops. I gotta advance this one, too. So this piece of animation you're seeing here, it was created, at least from the animator's point of view, without keyframes and without a hierarchy for primary rig controls. That means no channel box, no graph editor, no spline interpolation. In fact, actually no interpolation at all. If you were to open this scene in Maya and you were to take a look at the control rig, what you would see is a whole bunch of transforms in world space popping around from place to place. Why would you choose to do things in this way? Believe it or not, for speed. At least under some circumstances, with styles that are appropriate to this way of working. This piece, for instance, is fairly complex. The character goes through a lot of complex pose transformations. Using the ephemeral system, it took me about 6 hours, starting completely from scratch. No thumbnails or layout. When the style is right, when it's compatible with the existing system, I estimate between a 30% and 2 times speed up over conventional techniques for my workflow. Now, that's wholly unscientific. That's guesswork. Hopefully, I'll be able to get some actual data on that at some point, but it is certainly what it appears to be the case to me. And I do think it can be eventually expanded to work for other animation styles. So what is the problem this is supposed to solve? One of the main problems is that keyframes are not key poses. Keyframes are actually control points on a spline that drives a single scalar value. And in hierarchical rigging, these values are calculated in a fixed local space that is itself determined by other keyframes and by the complexity of a rig, which may have a whole lot of different possible states. And what this creates is a complex, opaque system that the animator has to mentally model in order to understand how to interact with the rig and the keyframing system. As animators, we sort of think of ourselves as crafting motion, but what we're actually doing is creating inputs for this complex keyframe rig system, and that is what actually generates the motion. And this can create a great deal of additional cognitive load. The consequences of this are not always great. I'm sure that all animators in general have had this experience of working with a bunch of, sorry, one second, there we go. Working with a block shot that you like, and going ahead and turning on interpolation and having it destroy your shot, which you then have to spend a whole bunch of time trying to resuscitate. You manually manage your rig state, your switches and blends, your FK and IK, and space switching. You've got to keep track of all that stuff. And as animators, we quite naturally want multiple ways of interacting with a rig. We want to be able to pose it in different ways using different sorts of techniques. But because all of these things need to be built into the rig at the same time, you'll end up with things like control rigs with 10,000 nodes. Gimbal lock's still a thing in 2019. IK pop's not a problem with IK, it's a problem with interpolation. And perhaps the worst aspect, from my point of view at least, is the emergent behavior you get between different levels of control in a character rig, where you may get motion that looks bad that you don't like, but which you can't just go and fix, because it's actually emerging from the interaction between a whole bunch of different controls with their own independent motion. Offsetting keys is, in theory at least, I think, a great idea. In practice, it causes so many issues in terms of your ability to continue editing your shot that many animators, myself included, have essentially abandoned the concept, except at the very end, at the very last stage of polish. And the end result of all of these consequences is that the decisions you make early in development of a shot, the decisions about where to place your keys, the decisions about what rig state to use in different parts of the shot, can paint you into a corner. You're going to have to live with those decisions, even if the direction you end up having to take the shot isn't really compatible with them. So I'm certainly not the first person to notice these issues. There have actually been a great many attempts to handle these issues, and many of them have met with a great deal of success. Frankly, I don't really think we'd have a viable character animation process if this wasn't the case. But I don't think I've ever seen a comprehensive solution that doesn't, at least to me, on some level, try to fit a square peg into a round hole. The solution I've come up with is what I call ephemeral rigging. So I wrote a custom rigging graph that's simple enough to be thrown away and rebuilt as needed. So essentially, it's ephemeral. It only exists while you use it. It vanishes while you don't. It acts more like a tool than a rig. It doesn't create any connections in your scene. And what you're seeing me do here is I've got my hand hovering over the keyboard with a whole bunch of hotkeys, and I've got my other hand on the mouse, and I'm posing in very freely, switching between modes on the fly as I do so. In a context like this, FK and IK are just different interaction modes. What that means, for instance, is that there is one control per control. There's not an IK elbow and an FK elbow, and an elbow that does some sort of broken rigging, and an elbow that offsets from either of those, those various blended methods, and controls to blend between them, and a gimbal correction elbow. There is one elbow. There is only ever one elbow. It is the elbow. It also means that space switching is implicit, which is kind of another way of saying that space switching doesn't really exist. Because it doesn't really need to. There's no canonical local space for any of these transforms in the first place. Whether they are connected to each other, whether they are operating in each other's space, depends entirely on what mode I happen to be in at this particular moment, and whether I've decided to hook them to each other. It also allows me to get bidirectional behavior without having to manage and break circularities. Because I'm rebuilding the graph for each interaction, depending on what the user has selected and what mode they're in. For one of the things that gets you rather easily is interchangeable forward and backward kinematics. So you essentially have FK and backward K. It means, for instance, that a reverse foot is no longer a special case. It's not a special system that needs to be installed specifically into a foot. It's just a use of backward K. Note that when I am using that, when I'm rotating the foot from the toe, it doesn't move the heel control away from the character's actual heel. There's one control per control, and those things are always unified. There isn't like some extra heel under there somewhere. The current implementation of this system sort of sits on top of Maya and like puppets it from the shadows. It triggers when the user interacts with ephemeral controls, and it breaks into the Maya evaluation cycle to set matrices directly. This does mean that the direction of control is one way. So I'm interacting with a control. It's going to push its matrix into the ephemeral graph. The ephemeral graph gets evaluated and then pushes its data back into the Maya scene, but it can't yet go back up the graph and push its data over to the same control that I'm manipulating, which does cause some issues with multiple selections. So one of the first things I'm going to be doing as I revise the system is investigate other methods of puppeting the Maya scene. Deformation is still achieved conventionally through the Maya node graph. In this case, in the examples I'm showing here, I'm using a proprietary spline-based deformer, the deformer that we originally called Ansiven Rig Tools. It isn't publicly available yet, but it will be soon. And the deformation rig also includes secondary controls like fingers and facial controls that are being done conventionally for performance reasons. However, it's set up so that the user doesn't really necessarily have to know the difference between those things. You can use them interchangeably fairly transparently. The performance issues, though, don't really have anything to do with the ephemeral graph itself, which, despite being written in Python, being completely unoptimized, and single-threaded, because Python, is actually extremely fast. The absolute worst-case scenario I was able to come up with actually only costs about 1/3 of a millisecond, because its simplicity makes up for the lack of optimization. However, there is a significant bottleneck currently in communicating with Maya. Actually setting just a dozen transforms through OpenMaya 2, which does wrap the API, so it's about as fast as I think you can get using this method, does cost about more than 11 milliseconds of the 12 milliseconds it takes me to run this graph. That's fast enough that it's still pretty effective for the rig that I'm using here. It's certainly not as fast as one would like ideally, which is another reason to investigate other methods of puppeting the Maya scene. It's also invisible to parallel eval, kind of necessarily, because there's no way for Maya to know what the ephemeral graph is doing. And the workflow I have at the moment requires me to switch back and forth, toggle back and forth between the two using a key. which again is a little awkward, but the advantages of posing with the system are sufficient to make that worthwhile. So, if transforms have no local space, how do you interpolate them to make animation actually animate? You don't. This is a system based around poses, not keyframes. And a pose is a fundamentally different concept than a keyframe. It's not a control point. It's more similar to a drawing in a 2D animation package like Toon Boom. You may notice, for instance, that I can edit a pose on any frame of its duration. Poses have duration, keyframes do not. Not just the first one where the key would be. Combined with the lack of rig state, or perhaps the ephemeralness of rig state, depending on how you look at it, this creates a one-to-one relationship between controls and movement, or controls and pose. If you were looking at a piece of animation made with the ephemeral system, there is one and only one possible configuration that the control rig could be in to result in that animation. So if you're passing off animation to other animators, there's no mystery about what's going on. They can look at the animation and immediately see what the controls are doing. Since you don't interpolate by creating, since you don't create animation by interpolation, instead you create in-betweens by creating new poses, using a breakdown and bias workflow not too dissimilar from tools like the tween machine. Because I'm calculating the breakdown, however, with the ephemeral graph, you can choose how the breakdown is created on the fly. So I can create it in a more linear way, or I can create it in a forward kinematics type way. And that just applies to this particular breakdown at the time I'm making it. I'm not leaving any residue in the scene, making assumptions about what I'm going to do in the future. What that means is that there's no special significance to key poses over other poses. They're just the ones I made first and that I decided were the extremes of motion. If I decide later on that that's not the extreme of motion, there's no persistent relationships between things in the scene to leave me painted into that corner. And I'm visualizing motion here fully through onion skinning, and onion skinning alone. Ideally, I would actually like motion trails as well. I do not want a graph editor, but I actually regard onion skinning as being the best possible method of understanding at least gross body movement. I can see how the poses flow into each other in a way that no other method of motion analysis allows. It does not allow the kind of subtlety that all styles of animation require, and you would need additional tools for further styles. But for the mixture of ones and twos and the very gross cartoony movement I'm working with here, it's ideal. To edit motion, I can re-break it down, and I can do that on individual parts of the body independently. So for instance, if I make a change to a particular pose, I can effectively blend it into other areas, the surrounding areas, by going to those poses and re-breaking them down. It also gives me a very direct way to solve discontinuities of motion. So you have that classic example where your character hits a wall, has a sudden momentum change on a particular frame. I can simply go to that frame and choosing whatever controls I think are relevant, I can re-break it down and re-break down the frames around it and make a few adjustments and solve that problem in a direct manner as opposed to trying to deal with tangents that will ultimately result in eventually solving it. That's not an effective method for animation that's entirely on ones and that requires significant subtlety, but I think it could be with further development of the tools. The current implementation actually does represent poses as keys internally, but it forces them to behave like poses with a Maya feature called keying groups. And I'm currently using Christoph Lendenfeld's viewport renderer for onion skins, which I highly recommend. It's open source and you can download it and use it with any workflow. What do we want to do in the future? Well, the current implementation could certainly be improved quite a bit. A custom evaluator might solve the parallel eval issues. An alternate method for driving the Maya DG could potentially solve the performance and multiple selection issues. I'd very much like to have 3D onion skinning, and I think it's possible, although rather difficult in the context of Maya. And for more conventional contexts, this might be an effective method of doing the earlier stages of animation, doing pose blocking, while still allowing you to use a conventional rig for final polish and for generating subframe interpolation for motion blur and simulation, essentially by transferring, either puppeting a conventional control rig or transferring data between an ephemeral interpolationless rig and a conventional control rig. I'm very much interested in implementing this for other software. I'm particularly interested in the idea of real-time workflows entirely within a game engine. But what I ultimately want is actually something I sort of think of as being like a ZBrush for animation. Back when, in the mid-2000s, when ZBrush was still first becoming popular, there was a real question as to whether dealing with a whole mass of micropolygons could possibly be more effective than just well-placed edge loops or well-placed isoparams. And the answer, of course, turned out to be actually, yeah, it's so much more effective that we barely ever work without sculpting first. I actually think that it's the same way with animation. I actually think that if we had good tools for manipulating dense animation data, then every single style of animation, and I'm including visual effects and games in that, we would all throw away keyframes and we'd never miss them. This is an untested idea, and I imagine it's controversial. I don't necessarily expect other animators to necessarily agree with me about it, but I would suggest that it offers certain advantages when working with other methods of generating motion. Simulation, mocap, procedural animation, none of these methods generate or interact with keyframes. They all generate dense data of one sort or another, either per frame data or potentially sub-frame data. And we don't have good tools to deal with that. So we're essentially forcing that into a keyframe model to allow animators to interact with it. I think that having good tools for manipulating dense data, and I think those are possible to create, would allow for, not only would it allow us to deal with those other methods of generating motion more effectively, it would actually allow us to be more effective character animators. So I wanted to end with a quote. This is by Eric Larson, one of the 9 Old Men. There's only 2 things that limit animation. One is the ability to imagine, and the other one is to draw what you imagine. Well, the ability to imagine is somewhat irreducible. The only way to increase your ability to do that is to gain more personal skill as an artist. But the ability to draw what you imagine, or to express what you imagine in the context of a CG animation tool, that is reducible. We could make that faster. And not only do I think we have an advantage in that regard in terms of the speed with which we can animate, I think that it has made my work more expressive and more fun. I've never felt more like I was expressing my ideas more directly and more succinctly than when using the ephemeral and interpolationless animation system, as opposed to feeling like I'm kind of dealing with a lot of switches and dials that will eventually result in the motion that I want, hopefully. I would like to thank these wonderful mammals who made this, made the development of this system possible, even if it was only by keeping my desk free of vermin. And there's a lot of depth to the ephemeral system that I've only been able to touch on briefly in this 20-minute talk. I would love to talk about it further with anyone who's interested, even after the question and answer period. Thank you.
So, Raf, I was wondering about scalability and performance when you have multiple characters in the scene.
Mm-hmm. So actually, one of the advantages of the system is that when you're doing scrubbing and playback, the control rig literally doesn't exist. So it is never going to be any worse for multiple characters than it would be under any other conditions. You're just dealing with deformation at that point, which obviously could have considerations, but they're not considerations that have anything to do with the ephemeral system. Depending on how fast your rig is, you may, the performance issues for interaction may or may not impact your ability to animate. The rigs I'm dealing with here are fairly fast, so it hasn't been that much of an issue for me. But certainly speeding up those particular performance issues is a significant concern. But it really has no effect on how many characters you have.
Thank you. There's a microphone right there if you want.
So there is a rig, and it's just a bunch of joints that are, or a bunch of nodes that are independent of each other, right? And
yes.
Information systems underneath that. So you could, in theory, interpolate between the poses in that rig if you chose to. You made a choice to do the step frame approach.
That's right. You could interpolate them, although it's worth noting that because they don't have a consistent local space, you're not likely to get a good result by just interpolating them. That said, you could, of course, bake them to a conventional rig and interpolate that if you choose.
Got it. Got it. Great. Yeah, that was my question is what
Yeah.
would happen if you interpolated them?
Yeah, I mean, they'd interpolate in world space, which,
Yeah.
you know, not that useful.
Got it. Awesome.